The steady tick-tock of the ancient wall clock behind the counter seemed to mock Paul Mercer as he stood in line at Harvest Bakery, his hand instinctively moving to cover the electronic ankle monitor beneath his worn jeans. 3 months out of Westfield Correctional, and the weight of his past still clung to him, like the persistent scent of prison disinfectant he couldn't seem to wash away. His parole officer had called that morning, a surprise drug test scheduled for tomorrow. It wasn't the test that worried him. It was the bus fare he didn't have after losing his second job in as many months. "Next," called the teenage cashier, barely looking up from her phone. When Paul approached and placed a single-day-old donut on the counter, she finally glanced up, her eyes widening slightly at his prison tattoos. The small crucifix inked between his thumb and forefinger, a foolish protection symbol from his early days inside, seemed to darken under her scrutiny. "$1.49, she said, her voice dropping an octave. Paul reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, counting them carefully. $1, 25, 30. He could feel the impatient breathing of the businessman behind him, could practically taste the collective judgment as he scraped together his change. 45 cents. That's all I've got." He held up the coins, watching as they caught the amber glow of the bakery's vintage lamps. The girl's mouth tightened. "It's $1.49. Could you?" The words stuck in Paul's throat like day-old bread. "Could you maybe cut me a break?" The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. 5 years inside had taught him that asking for mercy was just another form of self-humiliation. "Store policy," she said flatly, holding out her hand for him to take back his insufficient coins. The businessman behind him sighed audibly. Someone near the door whispered something containing the word criminals, and Paul felt a familiar heat crawl up his neck. He'd come here for a simple moment of normalcy, a small treat before tomorrow's appointment that would decide whether he remained free or returned to a cell. Now he stood exposed, his poverty and past on display like the perfectly arranged pastries in the glass case. "I'll cover it," came a woman's voice from behind the display case as she emerged from the kitchen, flour dusting her forearms and a streak of it across her cheek. Mid-40s, with kind eyes that somehow reminded Paul of his grandmother's. She wore a red apron over a simple white blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. "And give him one of those cinnamon rolls, too. The fresh ones." The cashier's eyebrows shot up, but she didn't argue. Paul stared at the woman, waiting for the catch, for the humiliating sermon or lecture about turning his life around. "You don't have to do that," he said, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. She smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "I know I don't have to. I want to." She wiped her hands on her apron and extended one across the counter. "I'm Grace Thornton. This is my bakery." Paul hesitated before shaking her hand, acutely aware of his calloused palm against her flour-soft one. "Paul," he said, offering nothing more. "Nice to meet you, Paul." Her smile remained genuine, unbothered by his brevity. "The cinnamon rolls just came out of the oven, best eaten while they're still warm." The cashier slid a white paper bag across the counter, the bottom already translucent with butter. Paul took it, the warmth seeping into his fingers, along with an unexpected tightness in his chest. "Thanks," he managed, taking his meager coins back and shoving them in his pocket. "Come back any time," Grace said, and something in her tone suggested she actually meant it. Paul nodded once and turned away, ignoring the still-waiting businessman's glare. Outside, the spring air carried the petrichor of a recent rain, a clean scent that momentarily overpowered the industrial odors of downtown. He paused under the bakery's striped awning, opened the bag, and took a bite of the cinnamon roll. The sweetness hit him first, then the warmth, the perfectly balanced spice. For a moment, just a moment, he closed his eyes and remembered Sunday mornings before his father left. Before his mother turned to pills, before his own series of increasingly desperate choices. He swallowed hard against the memory and the unexpected kindness it had awakened. Tomorrow he would face another test, another judgment, But for now, there was this small mercy, this unexpected grace from a stranger named, of all things, Grace. The bus idled at the corner, diesel fumes mingling with the ever-present scent of wet asphalt that seemed to define the city after rain. Paul climbed aboard, nodded to the driver who barely acknowledged him, and found a seat near the back. The cinnamon roll was long gone, but the empty bag sat folded in his pocket, a small reminder of unexpected kindness. His parole officer, Barrett, was waiting when Paul arrived at the nondescript government building. A thick-necked man with thinning hair and perpetually suspicious eyes, Barrett had been riding Paul since his release, convinced he'd violate his parole at the first opportunity. "You're 3 minutes late, Mercer," Barrett said, without looking up from his computer. "Bus was delayed," Paul replied, knowing it made no difference. Excuses were just that, excuses, and in Barrett's world, they were admissions of guilt. Barrett finally looked up. "Well, you know the drill. Cups on the counter in the bathroom, door stays open." The humiliation of observed drug tests never lessened, no matter how many times Paul endured them. He stood at the toilet, Barrett's presence in the doorway making his bladder seize up despite his need. The small crucifix tattoo on his hand seemed to burn as he gripped the plastic cup. "Sometime today, Mercer," Barrett said, checking his watch. Paul closed his eyes, thinking of flowing water, of rain-soaked streets, anything to make this moment end. When he finally finished and capped the sample, Barrett took it with a latex-gloved hand and labeled it. "Have a seat while we wait for the results," he said, gesturing to the hard plastic chair opposite his desk. Paul sat, his knee bouncing involuntarily as the clock on the wall tick-tock ticked, its sound nearly identical to the one in the bakery. His thoughts drifted to Grace Thornton's unexpected kindness, a small island in his sea of daily indignities. "So," Barrett said, leaning back in his chair, "you still at the warehouse?" Paul's stomach clenched. "Got let go last week." Barrett's eyebrows rose. "Reason?" "They said they overhired." Paul kept his voice even. "But one of the supervisors didn't like having an ex-con around. Made that pretty clear. And you've found new employment already, I assume, since maintaining employment is a condition of your parole." The tick-tock filled the silence between them. "I've put in applications," Paul said finally. 15 places last week, 3 more yesterday." Barrett made a note in Paul's file. "Housing situation still stable?" "Yes." That much was true. The halfway house was depressing and strict, but it was a roof. "Any contact with known felons or former associates?" "No." Also true. Paul had cut those ties completely, though the loneliness sometimes felt like a physical weight on his chest. Barrett studied him, searching for the lie. "Your test results should be back any minute. In the meantime, let's talk about your community service hours. You're behind." Paul's hands tightened on the chair's armrests. "It's hard to schedule around job hunting and the warehouse shifts before they let me go." "Not my problem, Mercer. You've completed 17 of your required 50 hours. At this rate, you'll finish sometime next year, well past your deadline." The office door opened, and a clerk handed Barrett a printout. He scanned it, his expression giving nothing away. Paul held his breath. "Clean," Barrett said finally, sounding almost disappointed. He slid a form across the desk. "Sign here acknowledging today's test. And Mercer, find a job within 10 days and get those community service hours moving, or we'll be having a very different conversation." Paul signed the form, his hand steady despite the knot in his stomach. 10 days to find work in a city where his record preceded him like a leper's bell. "Yes, sir," he said, because there was nothing else to say. Outside, the clouds had darkened, threatening another downpour. Paul checked his pocket. $2.35 remained, not enough for the return bus fare. The walk back to the halfway house would take over an hour, but he'd made it before, and would again. He'd gone 3 blocks when the skies opened. The sudden rain plastered his shirt to his skin, the water running down his face in rivulets. Most people ran for cover, but Paul kept walking. The rain washed away the sterile smell of Barrett's office, the lingering scent of judgment and doubt. In its place came the clean perfume of petrichor, of earth renewed. As he passed the small park that marked the halfway point home, he spotted a waterlogged flyer taped to a lamppost. Most of the text had blurred beyond recognition, but the header remained legible. Help wanted. Below it, barely visible through the soggy paper, was an address he recognized: Harvest Bakery. Paul stared at the sign, rain dripping from his nose and chin. The image of Grace Thornton's kind eyes and flour-dusted hands came to him unbidden. The idea of working at the bakery sent a complicated twist through his gut. Gratitude mingled with the dread of pity, of being the charity case, the project. He tore the flyer down anyway, folding the wet paper carefully and tucking it into his pocket alongside the empty cinnamon roll bag. 10 days to find work. Beggars couldn't be choosers, and he'd been begging one way or another since the day he'd walked out of Westfield's gates. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind puddles that reflected the cloud-scattered sky and the lingering scent of damp earth. Paul stood outside Harvest Bakery for nearly 10 minutes, watching through the window as Grace moved between ovens and counters with practiced efficiency. The early hour meant few customers, just an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner and a young mother with a toddler choosing a treat from the display case. His resolve nearly broke twice before he finally pushed open the door, the small bell above it announcing his entrance with cheerful betrayal. Grace looked up from where she was arranging fresh croissants, recognition dawning on her face. "Paul, right," she said, smiling as if his return was the most natural thing in the world. "Good morning." "Morning," he managed, suddenly aware of his shabby clothes, the cleanest he owned, but still visibly worn at the cuffs and collar. He pulled the now dried, crinkled flyer from his pocket. "I saw this, about the job." Grace wiped her hands on her apron, red again, the same shade as yesterday, and came around the counter. "You're interested in bakery work?" The question was simple enough, but Paul heard the unasked ones beneath it. "Can I trust you? Are you reliable? Will I regret this?" "I'm a fast learner," he said, which wasn't an answer. "I've worked kitchens before." This was true. The prison kitchen for 8 months, until a fight he hadn't started got him reassigned to laundry. "Experience helps, but it's not everything," Grace said, studying him with those kind but shrewd eyes. "The hours are early, 4 a.m. start time most days. Pays not great to start, but includes a meal per shift. Mostly I need someone for prep work, cleaning, and eventually customer service once you learn the ropes." Paul nodded, trying not to look too eager. "I can do early. I can do whatever you need." Grace seemed to make a decision. "Come on back. Let me show you around and we can talk details." The kitchen was warm and smelled of yeast and butter, a profound contrast to the industrial detergent reek of the halfway house. Steel racks held trays of rising dough, and a massive mixer stood in one corner. Everything was meticulously clean, but clearly well used. "It's just me and Jenny. You met her yesterday at the register, plus my nephew who helps on weekends," Grace explained, showing Paul the walk-in refrigerator and storage area. "I've been trying to do it all myself since my assistant baker moved out of state, but..." She gestured at the organized chaos of the kitchen. "It's becoming too much." As she talked through the job responsibilities and schedule, Paul found himself watching her hands, confident, capable, marked with small burn scars that told of years at the ovens. No wedding ring, he noticed, though there was a lighter band of skin suggesting there had been one once. "Which brings me to the obvious question," Grace was saying when Paul tuned back in. "I believe in second chances, Paul. I do. But I need to know what I'm getting into. You've been in trouble with the law, haven't you?" The directness of the question startled him, though he should have expected it. The crucifix tattoo on his hand seemed to throb, a reminder of poor choices inked permanently into his skin. "Yes," he said simply, no point in lies or evasion. 5 years for armed robbery. "I got out 3 months ago." He waited for her expression to change, for the warmth to recede behind the familiar wall of caution and judgment. Instead, she nodded, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "Are you on parole?" "Yes. For another 2 years, minimum. Any restrictions that would interfere with work? Weekly check-ins with my PO, random drug tests. I need to complete community service hours, but I can do those evenings and weekends." Grace considered this, the tick-tock of the vintage clock filling the silence between them. "I'll need to run a background check, that's standard. But I don't see why we can't give this a try. 2-week probation period, and we'll see how it goes. Can you start tomorrow?" Paul blinked, momentarily speechless. "Yes, absolutely. 4 a.m., she reminded him with a small smile. "Don't be late." "I won't," he promised, meaning it more than any promise he'd made in recent memory. As Grace led him back to the front of the bakery, she paused by a small bulletin board near the register. Among the business cards and community flyers was a worn photograph of a young man in military dress blues, his resemblance to Grace unmistakable in the shape of his eyes and smile. "My son, Michael," she said, following Paul's gaze. "He would have been 31 next month." The past tense told Paul everything he needed to know. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Grace touched the photo briefly, a gesture so gentle it made Paul look away. "Life gives us all our burdens to carry," she said quietly. "Some are just more visible than others." Her eyes flickered to the tattoos on his hands, but there was no judgment in her gaze. As Paul left the bakery, the weight of Barrett's 10-day ultimatum lifted slightly from his shoulders. Outside, puddles from the morning's rain still dotted the sidewalk, reflecting fragments of sky. The scent of petrichor lingered in the air, mingling with the buttery aroma that followed him from the bakery door. For the first time since his release, Paul felt something dangerous kindle in his chest. Hope. 4 a.m. arrived with the cruel persistence of all unwelcome hours. Paul had barely slept, afraid of missing his alarm and ruining this chance before it began. The halfway house was quiet as he slipped out, the night supervisor barely glancing up from his crossword puzzle. The streets were empty, the city transformed by darkness and the lingering mist that rose from rain-dampened asphalt. The walk to Harvest Bakery took 28 minutes. Paul had timed it twice the previous day. He arrived at 3:52, the lights already glowing behind the bakery's windows. Grace let him in with a nod, her hair pulled back and her red apron already dusted with flour. "Right on time. Good. There's an apron on the hook by the sink. Wash up and we'll get started." The work was physical and demanding. Hauling 50-pound bags of flour, kneading massive quantities of dough, scrubbing equipment between batches. By 7 a.m., when the first customers began to arrive, Paul's arms ached, and a thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead despite the kitchen's air conditioning. "Not bad for a first day," Grace said, handing him a cup of coffee, his third, and a still warm cheese, Danish. "Take 15, then I'll show you how to operate the dishwasher correctly." Paul accepted both gratefully, settling on a stool in the corner of the kitchen. Through the pass-through window, he could see Jenny at the register, her customer service smile so different from the suspicious look she'd given him on his first visit. The steady tick-tock of the wall clock marked his break, a rhythmic counterpoint to the morning rush beyond the kitchen doors. Grace worked as she talked, her movements efficient and practiced. "I've been baking since I was tall enough to reach the counter standing on a chair," she explained, rolling out puff pastry with smooth, even strokes. "My grandmother taught me first. Then I went to culinary school for a year before Michael was born." "Your son," Paul said, remembering the photograph. Grace nodded, her hands never stopping their work. "Had him young. Raised him alone after his father decided family life wasn't for him." Dries, there was no bitterness in her voice, just a matter-of-fact acceptance. "Opened this place when Michael was 12, built it up from nothing but credit card debt and stubborn determination." "It's a nice place," Paul said, meaning it. In daylight, he could better appreciate the bakery's charm, the vintage light fixtures casting that amber glow, the mismatched but comfortable chairs, the local artwork adorning the walls. It was Michael's favorite place, Grace said, a shadow crossing her features briefly. He used to help me on weekends, just like you're doing now. Had a real talent for it. Paul wanted to ask what happened to her son, but held his tongue. Some grief was too private to probe uninvited. By the end of his shift at noon, Paul's muscles screamed with the unfamiliar exertion, but a sense of satisfaction hummed beneath the fatigue. He had been useful, had created rather than destroyed. The half-dozen misshapen dinner rolls Grace allowed him to attempt would never see a customer's plate, but she'd pronounced them not bad for a first try, with a genuine smile that somehow mattered more than it should. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, as he hung up his flour-dusted apron. "Yes, ma'am," he said, the formal address slipping out unintentionally. "Grace?" she corrected him gently. "Just Grace." Paul nodded, oddly moved by the simple humanity of the exchange. "Thank you, Grace." The walk back to the halfway house felt shorter somehow, despite his exhaustion. The afternoon sun had burned away the morning mist, but the scent of recent rain still clung to the trees lining the street. For the first time in years, Paul found himself noticing small details. The pattern of light through leaves, the particular blue of the sky, the way the city smelled different in sunshine than in shadow. Barrett called that evening, his voice suspicious over the crackling connection. "Got a call from your new employer today," he said without preamble. "Bakery owner? Wants to confirm your employment." "Yes," Paul said, tension creeping back into his shoulders. "Harvest Bakery. I started today." Barrett's skepticism was audible. "Convenient timing. I told you 10 days, and suddenly you've got a job the very next day." "I saw their help wanted sign," Paul explained, keeping his voice even despite the rising heat in his chest. "I applied. She hired me." "She know about your record?" "Yes. I told her everything." Barrett was silent for a moment, clearly thrown by Paul's transparency. "Well, keep the job this time, Mercer. And remember, you still need those community service hours. 25 done by month's end, or we've got problems." "Understood," Paul said, the familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders. After hanging up, Paul sat on the edge of his narrow bed, staring at the peeling paint of the halfway house wall. On the small table beside him sat his meager possessions, a dog-eared paperback, a photo of his mother from before the pills took her, and now carefully smoothed and folded, the empty bag that had once held Grace's cinnamon roll. Outside his window, the evening light caught the puddles remaining from yesterday's rain, turning ordinary water into momentary gold. Days blurred into weeks at Harvest Bakery. Paul's hands grew calloused in new places, his arms stronger, his skills incrementally better. Grace was a patient teacher, correcting without criticizing, praising genuine effort. She shared her knowledge freely. The precise temperature that turned sugar to caramel, the way to tell if dough had been kneaded enough by the feel of it against your palm, the secret to flaky croissants, European butter and endless folding. "I met a real Christian once," read the title of a book Paul noticed on the small shelf in Grace's office, where he sometimes ate lunch when the cafe was crowded. "And I was never the same again," completed the title on the spine. The author's name had worn away, but something about the title resonated with him, though he couldn't say why. Most days, Paul arrived to find Grace already at work, her red apron a constant in the pre-dawn kitchen. But on a rainy Tuesday, 4 weeks into his employment, he arrived to find the bakery dark and locked. He waited under the awning, watching the rain create tiny rivers along the curb, carrying fallen leaves in miniature tributaries. The scent of petrichor was strong, competing with the ever-present hint of yeast and sugar that seemed to emanate from the building itself. At 4:15, a car pulled up, and Grace emerged with an umbrella and a distracted expression. "I'm so sorry," she said as she unlocked the door, her voice tight with something Paul couldn't identify. lost track of time this morning. Inside, as they began the familiar routine of morning prep, Paul noticed Grace's movements lacked their usual precision. Twice she measured ingredients incorrectly. Once she nearly burned a tray of croissants, something he'd never seen her do. "Everything okay?" he asked finally, as she stared blankly at a bowl of buttercream frosting. Grace looked up, seeming to really see him for the first time that morning. Her eyes were rimmed with red, the amber bakery lights highlighting the pallor of her skin. She shook her head. "It's Michael's birthday, would have been." "I'm sorry," Paul said, meaning it deeply. In the weeks he'd worked alongside her, Grace had mentioned her son occasionally, but never explained his absence. Now, seeing the raw grief etched into her features, Paul wished he could offer more than empty words. Grace wiped her hands on her apron, blue today, a departure from her usual red. "There's a box," she said suddenly. "In my office, top shelf of the bookcase. Could you get it for me? I need to check the sourdough." Paul found the box easily. A simple wooden container with a small cross carved into its lid. He brought it to Grace, who had moved to the back door of the kitchen, now propped open to the small alley behind the bakery, where delivery trucks usually parked. The rain had stopped, leaving behind that familiar clean scent and a sky beginning to lighten with dawn. "Thank you," Grace said, taking the box. After a moment's hesitation, she opened it, revealing a collection of small items, a tarnished medal, a folded letter, a smooth stone, a broken watch with a cracked face. "Michael was a Marine," she said, lifting the medal gently. "2 tours in Afghanistan. Came home with all his limbs but not all of his mind. PTSD, they called it, but that doesn't begin to cover what he went through." She touched the watch next. This was on his wrist when they found him. 27 years old, and he couldn't see a way to keep living with the memories. The quiet tick-tock of the bakery clock seemed to grow louder in the silence that followed her words. "I'm sorry," Paul said again, inadequate but sincere. "I can't imagine." "No one can, until it happens to them." Grace carefully returned the items to the box. "For a while I was angry at God, so angry I could barely breathe with it. How could he let this happen? How could my prayers not be enough?" She looked out at the lightening sky. "But anger is heavy, Paul. Too heavy to carry forever." Paul thought of his own anger, at his father for leaving, at his mother for choosing pills over him, at a system designed to punish rather than rehabilitate, at himself for every poor choice that led to 5 years behind bars. The familiar weight of it pressed against his ribs. "How did you—" he began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the question. "Let it go," Grace supplied. She closed the box carefully. "I haven't, not completely. But I found that helping others made my own burden lighter somehow. Each person who comes through that door," she nodded toward the front of the bakery, "is carrying something, some weight, some worry. If I can make that load a little easier, even just with a good cup of coffee and a moment of kindness." She shrugged. "It doesn't bring Michael back, but it honors who he was, who he really was, before the war changed him." She tucked the box under her arm and turned back toward the kitchen. "We should get those cinnamon rolls in the oven. Tuesday's our busiest morning." As they worked side by side in the gradually brightening kitchen, Paul felt something shift between them. A deepening of trust, perhaps, or a recognition of shared pain carried differently. The clock tick-tocked steadily, marking the rhythm of their labor, while outside, the last of the rain clouds gave way to strips of blue. The community garden sat on what had once been an abandoned lot, transformed through volunteer labor and stubborn optimism into a green oasis amid urban concrete. Paul knelt in the damp soil, sweat beading on his forehead despite the shade of a nearby oak. 6 weeks of bakery work had strengthened his arms and hands, making the work of turning compacted earth almost meditative. 2 more hours today puts you at 36 total, said Martina, the garden coordinator, consulting her clipboard. A retired teacher with silver braids and no-nonsense glasses, she was one of the few people who treated Paul exactly the same as any other volunteer. "You're making good progress." Paul nodded his thanks, returning to the methodical work of preparing the bed for late summer planting. The rich scent of earth rose around him, reminiscent of petrichor but deeper, more fundamental. His hands, once used for destruction, now created space for growth. Barrett had been surprised, suspicious even, when Paul reported his accelerating community service hours. But the reality was simple. Working at Harvest Bakery had given Paul's days structure and purpose, making it easier to carve out time for the garden project. His halfway house curfew still limited his evenings, but he'd found that 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. at the bakery left his afternoons free for community service, while still allowing time for laundry and the odd errand. As Paul worked, he found his thoughts returning to Grace and the morning she'd shared her son's story. In the weeks since, something had changed between them, a mutual recognition perhaps of pain acknowledged but not defining. She smiled more often now, even laughed sometimes at Paul's dry observations or the antics of the preschool children who pressed their noses against the bakery's display case every Thursday morning. Yesterday, she'd declared his sourdough loaves actually decent and allowed 3 to be sold alongside her own. The small triumph had filled him with a pride he couldn't quite name. "You're good with plants," Martina observed, interrupting his thoughts as she inspected his work. "Ever done gardening before?" Paul shook his head. "Never had the chance." "Well, you have a knack for it. Those tomato seedlings you transplanted last week are thriving." The simple praise warmed him more than it should have. "Thanks," he said, awkward with the unfamiliar feeling of having done something well, something that mattered. When his shift ended, Paul washed up at the garden's outdoor sink, the cool water sluicing away dirt and sweat. His reflection in the small mirror above the basin showed a face changing in subtle ways, less gaunt, perhaps, the perpetual wariness in his eyes softening into something less defensive. The crucifix tattoo on his hand seemed different somehow too, though the ink remained unchanged. Once a reminder of prison desperation, it had begun to take on new associations. The cross carved into Michael's memorial box, the small silver one Grace wore on a chain around her neck, the way her hands sometimes formed the shape of it unconsciously while she prayed over particularly challenging dough. Walking back to the halfway house, Paul passed Harvest Bakery, closed now for the day. Through the window, he could see Grace wiping down counters, her red apron smudged with evidence of the day's work. She glanced up, spotted him, and waved with a smile that carried across the distance between them. Paul waved back, a simple gesture that somehow contained multitudes. He continued on his way, aware of something unfamiliar expanding in his chest. Not quite peace, perhaps, but the space where peace might one day grow. The storm arrived without warning, a summer deluge that turned streets into temporary rivers and sent pedestrians scrambling for shelter. Paul, caught halfway between the community garden and the halfway house, ducked into the covered bus stop, already crowded with other rain refugees. Thunder cracked overhead, followed almost immediately by lightning that illuminated the darkened streets in stark relief. The smell of rain-soaked asphalt rose strong around them, that familiar petrichor now tinged with ozone. "Some weather, huh?" said an older man pressed against Paul in the cramped shelter. He wore work clothes similar to Paul's, jeans and a t-shirt stained with honest labor. "Yeah," Paul agreed, watching the rain bounce off the flooded sidewalk. "You work at Thornton's Bakery, right?" the man continued. "Seen you coming and going. I'm at the auto shop across the street." Paul nodded, momentarily taken aback by being recognized as something other than an ex-con. "Yeah, for a couple months now. Good lady, that Grace Thornton. After her boy died, thought she might close up shop for good. Dark time." The man shook his head. "Whole neighborhood worried about her." Paul said nothing, unsure how to respond to this unexpected glimpse into Grace's life from an outside perspective. "But she pulled through," the man continued, seemingly unbothered by Paul's silence. Stronger than she looks, that one. Faith like iron. The rain intensified, drumming against the shelter's roof with increasing insistence. Paul checked his watch. 37 minutes until curfew check at the halfway house. If the storm didn't let up soon, he'd have to make a run for it or risk a violation. As if reading his thoughts, the man pointed to a large golf umbrella leaning against the bench. Take it if you need to get somewhere. My shift doesn't end for hours. Paul hesitated, suspicious of the offer. I couldn't. Sure you can. Just drop it by Lou's auto body when you get a chance. No rush. The simple kindness, offered without expectation or judgment, left Paul momentarily speechless. Thanks, he managed finally, taking the umbrella. I will. Minutes later, Paul made his way through the downpour, the borrowed umbrella providing imperfect but welcome protection. The storm had driven most people indoors, leaving the streets eerily empty, except for the occasional car creeping through flooded intersections. He was 3 blocks from the halfway house when he heard it, a faint cry, nearly drowned out by thunder and pounding rain. Paul paused, scanning the deserted street. There, in the recessed doorway of a closed shop, a hunched figure struggled with something at their feet. Caution warred with curiosity. His parole conditions were clear. No unnecessary risks, no involvement in potential criminal activity, nothing that might compromise his precarious freedom. And yet, the cry came again, more distinct this time. Without consciously deciding, Paul found himself crossing the street, the umbrella tilted against the driving rain. As he approached, the figure resolved into a young woman kneeling beside a large cardboard box that was rapidly disintegrating in the rain. Inside the box, barely visible through the collapsing sides, were 3 tiny puppies, their eyes not yet open. They'll drown, the woman said without looking up, her voice tight with desperation. The box is falling apart. I found them behind the dumpster, but I can't. She broke off, her hands trembling as she tried to hold the sodden cardboard together. Paul made a split-second decision. He shoved the umbrella at the woman. Hold this, he instructed, already stripping off his jacket. He spread it on the ground, then carefully lifted each whimpering puppy onto the makeshift bed. Once all 3 were safely transferred, he bundled the corners together, creating an improvised sling. The shelter's 6 blocks from here, the woman said, clutching the umbrella with white-knuckled hands. But I can't leave my post. I'm the night manager at the pharmacy, and if I'm not back in 3 minutes, the security system alerts the police. Paul glanced at his watch. 23 minutes until curfew check. Not enough time to go 6 blocks to the shelter and back to the halfway house. I'll take them, he heard himself say, the words surprising him as much as they seemed to surprise the woman. You will? Relief flooded her face. Thank you. They're on Madison and 4th. Big blue sign, can't miss it. Paul nodded, already calculating. He'd miss curfew check. Barrett would be notified. His parole could be revoked. All for 3 abandoned puppies he could have pretended not to see. The tick-tock of time's passage seemed to fill his head as he made his choice. Keep the umbrella, he told the woman, already turning away with his precious bundle. They need it more than I do. And the journey to the animal shelter was a blur of rain and racing thoughts. The puppies, warm against his chest despite their dampness, whimpered occasionally, but seemed calmer in their new arrangement. Paul found himself murmuring to them as he jogged, nonsense reassurances that felt strangely natural on his tongue. The shelter was indeed unmistakable, its blue sign illuminated even in the storm. The woman at the front desk looked up in surprise as Paul burst in, dripping onto the linoleum floor. Found them abandoned, he explained breathlessly, carefully unwrapping his jacket to reveal the 3 tiny lives within. They need help. What followed was a flurry of activity, the puppies whisked away by a veterinary technician, forms to fill out, questions about where exactly they'd been found. Through it all, the clock in Paul's head continued its relentless tick-tock, counting down the minutes past his curfew, tallying the potential cost of his decision. When he finally emerged from the shelter, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. His jacket, returned to him damp and smelling of puppy, provided little protection against the chill that had followed the storm. Without the urgency of his mission, exhaustion swept over him, along with the full realization of what he'd done. He was 47 minutes late when he finally reached the halfway house. The night supervisor, a thin man with perpetually suspicious eyes, looked up from his logbook with grim satisfaction. "Curfew violation, Mercer," he said, already reaching for the phone. "You know the drill." Paul knew. The supervisor would call Barrett, who would file the report. Depending on Barrett's mood and the judge's discretion, the consequences could range from a warning to a return to Westfield Correctional. All for 3 puppies that would have probably died without intervention. As he sat on his narrow bed, still damp, and now trembling slightly with fatigue and nerves, Paul found himself thinking of Grace, of her son's memorial box, of her hands shaping dough with care and precision, of her quiet statement, "If I can make that load a little lighter." He had made a choice tonight, not calculated or self-serving, but impulsive and costly. Yet for all his fear of the consequences, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Outside his window, the storm was passing, leaving behind puddles that reflected the emerging stars. The scent of rain-soaked earth drifted through the partially open window, carrying with it the promise of cleaner air, of momentary renewal. Paul closed his eyes, his hand unconsciously moving to cover the crucifix tattoo that had begun to represent something more complex than prison desperation. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he found himself forming words that might have been a prayer. Barrett's office seemed smaller somehow, the walls closer, the ceiling lower. Paul sat in the familiar hard plastic chair, his hands resting on his knees in a deliberately non-threatening posture he'd perfected during his incarceration. "A curfew violation," Barrett said, his voice heavy with disappointment that didn't quite ring true. 3 months of playing it straight, and you throw it away for what, Mercer? What was so important that you risked going back inside? Paul met his parole officer's gaze directly. "Puppies." Barrett blinked. "Excuse me? 3 abandoned puppies that would have drowned in the storm if I hadn't taken them to the shelter." Barrett leaned back in his chair, clearly thrown by the unexpected explanation. "Puppies," he repeated flatly. "Yes, sir. I have the intake form from the shelter, signed by the veterinary technician who received them." Paul withdrew the slightly crumpled paper from his pocket and placed it on the desk between them. Barrett picked it up, scanned it, his expression cycling through suspicion, confusion, and something that might have been reluctant respect. "You missed curfew by 47 minutes to save puppies," he said finally. "Yes, sir." The familiar tick-tock of Barrett's office clock filled the silence between them. Outside, the morning sun cast shadows through the blinds, striping Barrett's desk with light and darkness. "You understand I still have to report this," Barrett said eventually. "The system doesn't care why you violated curfew, just that you did." "I understand." Barrett studied him, seeming to really see him for perhaps the first time. "You're working at that bakery, completing your community service hours ahead of schedule, and now risking your parole to save abandoned animals." He shook his head slightly. "People don't change that much, Mercer. Not in my experience." The words stung with their implicit accusation, their assumption of hidden motives or inevitable failure. But beneath the sting, Paul recognized something else in Barrett's tone: uncertainty, as if the narrative he'd constructed around Paul was beginning to fray at the edges. "Maybe not," Paul conceded, "but they can try." Barrett made a non-committal sound, turning his attention to his computer. "I'll file the report today. The hearing will likely be scheduled within 2 weeks. Until then, you maintain all existing parole conditions, including curfew." He looked up, his expression stern. "No more heroic puppy rescues after hours, understood?" "Understood," Paul agreed, rising to leave. "And Mercer?" Paul paused at the door. "Next time, call it in. Even if you're going to be late, a heads-up counts for something." It wasn't forgiveness or even understanding, but it was something, a small crack in the wall of suspicion that had defined their relationship since Paul's release. "Thank you, sir. I will." Outside Barrett's office, the day had blossomed into full summer glory. The sidewalks dried from yesterday's storm, the air carrying that particular clarity that sometimes follows heavy rain. Paul walked to Harvest Bakery with a strange lightness despite the uncertainty hanging over him. He had made a choice last night, a choice to help rather than turn away, to act rather than observe. And whatever the consequences, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Grace looked up from the dough she was kneading when Paul entered through the back door, 15 minutes late for his shift. The kitchen smelled of vanilla and warm sugar, and the amber lights cast everything in that familiar golden glow. "Sorry I'm late," Paul said, reaching for his apron. "Had a meeting with my parole officer." Grace's hand stilled. "Everything okay?" Paul hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Not really. I missed curfew last night because of the storm. There's going to be a hearing." He didn't mention the puppies, somehow reluctant to position himself as any kind of hero. But as he washed his hands at the sink, the whole story spilled out anyway. The rain, the woman's desperation, the tiny lives bundled in his jacket, the choice that felt like no choice at all. When he finished, Grace was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You could have just kept walking," she said softly. "No one would have blamed you." "I would have known," Paul replied simply. Grace nodded, as if he'd confirmed something important. "The hearing, what's likely to happen?" Paul dried his hands on a kitchen towel, buying time before answering. "Best case, a warning. Worst case, they revoke my parole. Send me back to finish my sentence." "For saving puppies?" Grace's voice rose with indignation. "For violating the conditions of my release," Paul corrected gently. "They don't really care why." Grace's mouth set in a determined line. "We'll need a character witness, someone to speak on your behalf at the hearing." "We? Of course we. You think I'm going to let them send you back for an act of basic human decency?" Grace dusted flour from her hands with quick, decisive movements. "I'll speak for you, and we'll find others. Martina from the garden project, maybe that woman from the shelter." Paul stared at her, momentarily speechless. In all his calculations about consequences, he had never considered the possibility of someone fighting for him, standing beside him. "You'd do that?" he asked finally, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Of course I would." Grace's tone suggested it was the most natural thing in the world. "Now we've got cranberry-orange scones to prepare for the morning rush, and I still need to show you the proper way to glaze them." As they worked side by side in the warm kitchen, the steady tick-tock of the wall clock keeping rhythm with their movements, Paul felt that dangerous hope unfurling further in his chest. The crucifix tattoo on his hand no longer seemed like a prison relic, but something transforming, like the dough beneath Grace's capable hands, into something new and unexpected. Outside, the last puddles from yesterday's storm were evaporating in the summer sun, but the scent of petrichor lingered, a reminder of renewal after deluge. The hearing room was smaller than Paul had expected, with fluorescent lighting that cast everyone in an unflattering pallor. He sat at a small table facing the parole board, 3 people whose expressions revealed nothing as they reviewed his file. Barrett sat to one side, his face similarly impassive. Behind Paul, in the small gallery of metal folding chairs, sat his unlikely supporters, Grace in a simple blue dress rather than her customary red apron, Martina from the garden project with her silver braids neatly arranged, Jenny from the bakery counter looking uncomfortable but determined, and, most surprisingly, the young woman from the pharmacy who had first found the puppies, now holding a folder containing photographs of the rescues, thriving in their foster home. The board chairwoman, a stern-faced woman with steel-grey hair and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, called the hearing to order. "We're here to review the parole violation of Paul Mercer, currently under supervision following his release from Westfield Correctional. she began, her voice as colorless as the room itself. Mr. Mercer violated curfew on June 17th by a period of 47 minutes. Officer Barrett has submitted his report, which I have before me. She looked up, fixing Paul with a penetrating stare. Mr. Mercer, do you contest the fact of this violation? No, ma'am, Paul replied evenly. I was late for curfew check, and your explanation for this violation. Paul recounted the events of that rainy night as straightforwardly as possible. The storm, the discovered puppies, the decision to take them to the shelter despite knowing he would miss curfew. The chairwoman listened without comment, then turned to Barrett. Officer Barrett, your assessment. Barrett cleared his throat. The violation is documented and uncontested. However, I have verified Mr. Mercer's account with the animal shelter, and their records confirm his arrival time and the condition of the animals he brought in. He paused, then added, In my professional opinion, this incident appears to be an isolated lapse in judgment, rather than a pattern of non-compliance. It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but coming from Barrett, it was practically effusive. Paul kept his expression neutral, but something loosened slightly in his chest. We have several character witnesses present, the chairwoman noted, glancing at her paperwork. Given the nature of the violation and Officer Barrett's assessment, the board is willing to hear brief statements. Please keep your remarks concise and relevant to Mr. Mercer's rehabilitation and community integration. Grace spoke first, rising from her chair with quiet dignity. My name is Grace Thornton. I own Harvest Bakery, where Paul has worked for the past 3 months. In that time, he has been unfailingly reliable, honest and hard-working. He arrives early, stays late when needed, and has become essential to our operation. She paused, then added with simple conviction, I trust him completely, not just with my business, but with the well-being of my customers and staff. His actions on the night in question reflect the character I've come to know, someone who chooses to help others, even at personal cost. Martina followed, speaking of Paul's dedication at the community garden, his patience with the neighborhood children who sometimes visited, the care he took with even the smallest seedlings. The pharmacy worker described his unhesitating response to the puppy's plight, his refusal of the umbrella so the animals could stay dry. Throughout these testimonials, Paul kept his eyes fixed on the table before him, overwhelmed by the portrait they painted, not of a former inmate perpetually one mistake away from returning to prison, but of a man trying, however imperfectly, to rebuild something worth saving. When the witnesses finished, the chairwoman addressed Paul directly. Mr. Mercer, do you have anything to add before the board deliberates? Paul looked up, meeting her gaze. Only that I understand the seriousness of violating parole conditions. I made a choice that night, knowing there might be consequences. I don't regret helping the puppies, but I do regret not calling to notify my halfway house supervisor, as I should have done. The board members exchanged glances, then rose to confer in private. As they filed out, Paul finally allowed himself to look back at the small group who had come to support him. Grace gave him a reassuring smile, her hands folded in her lap in what might have been prayer. The crucifix tattoo on Paul's hand seemed to catch the harsh, fluorescent light as he returned his attention to the front of the room. The familiar tick-tock of a wall clock counted the minutes of deliberation, each second carrying the weight of possibility and consequence. When the board returned, their faces revealed nothing. The chairwoman adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Paul. Mr. Mercer, after reviewing your case, including Officer Barrett's report and the testimony of your character witnesses, this board has decided not to revoke your parole at this time. Paul released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. However, she continued, this violation will remain on your record, and any further infractions will result in immediate review with likely revocation. Additionally, you will serve 20 additional hours of community service, preferably at the animal shelter that received the puppies in question. A flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed her features. They could likely use the help. Thank you, ma'am. Paul said, his voice steady despite the relief flooding through him. "This hearing is adjourned." Outside the building, in the bright July sunshine, Paul found himself surrounded by his unlikely advocates. Grace squeezed his arm gently. "I told you it would be okay." "You did," Paul agreed, still slightly dazed by the outcome. "Thank you, all of you. I don't know what to say." "You'd have done the same for any of us," Grace said with quiet certainty. "Now, I believe this calls for celebration. Cinnamon rolls on the house when we get back to the bakery." As they walked together through the summer-bright streets, Paul found himself noticing details with renewed appreciation. The particular blue of the sky, the pattern of light through leaves, the faint scent of petrichor rising from a sprinkler-dampened lawn. The crucifix tattoo on his hand caught the sunlight as he walked, no longer a mark of prison desperation, but a symbol transforming day by day into something new. Autumn arrived with subtle persistence, the summer heat giving way to crisp mornings and golden afternoons. 6 months had passed since Paul first stood in line at Harvest Bakery, counting insufficient coins for a day-old donut. 6 months of pre-dawn shifts and flower-dusted aprons, of community garden work and animal shelter volunteering, of small choices accumulating like stitches in a garment slowly taking shape. The halfway house was behind him now, replaced by a small studio apartment above a bookstore 3 blocks from the bakery. The space was modest but clean, with a window that caught the morning light and walls Paul had painted himself, covering institutional beige with a warm amber that reminded him of the bakery's glow. Grace had promoted him to assistant baker, entrusting him with increasingly complex responsibilities, developing new recipes, training the high school student who now worked the counter on weekends, occasionally managing the bakery alone when Grace took rare days off. His parole check-ins with Barrett had decreased to monthly meetings, brief and professional, without the earlier undercurrent of suspicion. "I met a real Christian once, and I was never the same again," still sat on the shelf in Grace's office, its spine now familiar to Paul, though he'd never opened it. Something about the title had become a touchstone of sorts, a private marker of his own unfolding story. On a Wednesday morning in late October, Paul arrived at the bakery to find Grace already there as usual, but with an unexpected addition: a small, gangly puppy curled in a bed tucked into the corner of the kitchen. "What's this?" Paul asked, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. Grace looked up from the dough she was kneading, a slight flush on her cheeks. "This is Mercy, one of your rescues, all grown up. The shelter called yesterday. Her adoption fell through, and they remembered I'd inquired about her. She needs a home, and she shrugged, a small self-conscious gesture. "The house has been empty since Michael." The puppy, black with a white chest and one white paw, raised her head at their voices, tail thumping tentatively against her bed. Paul crouched down, extending his hand for the puppy to sniff. "Hello, Mercy," he said softly. She licked his fingers, her tail wagging with more confidence. "I thought maybe she could be our bakery mascot," Grace said, returning to her dough. "Customers always love a friendly dog." "She's perfect," Paul agreed, straightening to wash his hands at the sink. As he reached for the soap, his gaze caught on his reflection in the small mirror above the basin, a face transformed not just by the months of good food and honest work, but by something deeper, something less tangible, but no less real. The crucifix tattoo on his hand had faded somewhat with time and work, but it remained, now carrying associations far different from its origins. Grace's quiet faith, the cross carved into Michael's memorial box, the mercy shown to Paul himself by people who had every reason to judge him, but chose to see possibility instead. The steady tick-tock of the bakery clock marked the rhythm of their morning preparations, a sound that had once reminded Paul of institutional timekeeping, but now spoke of order and purpose, of life measured in rises and bakes, in service and small kindnesses. Outside, the October sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, illuminating the last puddles from yesterday's rain. The scent of petrichor mingled with the warm, yeast-rich aroma of the bakery, creating something new and complex from the combination. "Paul," Grace said, interrupting his thoughts, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you." He turned, taking in her flour-dusted apron, red again today, and the slight nervousness in her expression. "The church I attend, nothing fancy, just a small community. They're hosting a dinner next weekend for people who have experienced challenges, prison, addiction, homelessness." She brushed flour from her hands, not quite meeting his eyes. "They asked me to bring someone who could speak about second chances, about transformation. I thought of you." Paul was silent for a moment, processing her request. In the 6 months since his release, he had rebuilt much of his life, but faith, formal, declared faith, remained territory he hadn't fully explored, despite the ways it had begun to permeate his thinking. "You don't have to," Grace added quickly. "It's completely your choice. I just thought—" "I'll do it," Paul said, surprising himself with the immediacy of his decision. "I'd be honored." Grace looked up, relief and pleasure lighting her features. "Really? Really?" Paul smiled, the expression coming more naturally now than it once had, "though I'm not sure what I'd say." "Just tell your story," Grace suggested simply. "How you went from where you were to where you are." As they worked side by side in the warm kitchen, preparing the day's offerings, Paul found his thoughts drifting to the title of that book he'd never read. "I met a real Christian once, and I was never the same again." He thought of Grace's quiet faith expressed through daily acts of kindness, of the way she had stood beside him at his hearing, of her patient teaching and unwavering belief in second chances. The crucifix tattoo on his hand caught the amber light as he shaped dough into loaves, the symbol transformed by association into something healing rather than desperate. Outside, the last puddles from yesterday's rain reflected fragments of autumn sky, while inside the clock tick-tocked steadily, marking not just the passage of time, but its redemption. Mercy, the rescued puppy, settled more comfortably into her bed, her presence a living reminder of the night Paul had chosen compassion over caution, and how that choice, costly though it had seemed, had become a turning point in his journey. As the bakery filled with morning light and the scent of fresh bread, Paul found himself silently rehearsing the words he might share at the church dinner. "I met a real Christian once," he would begin, "and I was never the same again."